So this person asked me to provide some sources, so I will. But first I would like to thank you for asking so I can supply you and the rest of the world with a great source, because it is very important that the people will get educated about the history of these events. This is your favorite half Chinese, and as promised, this is one source that will beat all other sources. This source comes directly from the US regime, Office of the Historian. So I read the small parts, and what actually has to do with the particular video, you can read the rest on the site, leaving it somewhere. Between 1937 and 1941, escalating conflict between China and Japan influenced U.S. relations with both nations and ultimately contributing to pushing the United States towards full-scale war with Japan and Germany. You see, they weren't at war at first. It was because of those events, right? Is what I told you in the previous video. At the outset, US officials viewed development in China with ambivalence. On the one hand, they opposed Japanese incursions into the northeast China and the rise of Japanese militarism in the area, in part because of their sense of a long-standing friendship with China. That is a load of bull, I must admit, but they will let you know themselves later on. On the other hand, most US officials believed that it had no vital interest in China worth going to war over with Japan. Moreover, the domestic conflict between Chinese nationalists and communists left US policymakers uncertain of success in aiding such an internally divided nation. Because what would happen if they would help China and China would get rid of the Japanese but the communists come to power? That's not good, so let's just not help them. That's the mindset, right? As a result, few US officials recommended taking a strong stance prior to 1937, and so the United States did little to help China for fear of provoking Japan. Or was it for fear of losing money that they were making at that moment? Because that will come in the later chapters. The U.S. likelihood of providing aid to China increased after July 7, 1937, when Chinese and Japanese forces clashed on the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, throwing the two nations into a full-scale war. That actually was a false flag operation. Nice, right? As the United States watched Japanese forces sweep down the coast and then into the capital of Nanjing, popular opinion swung firmly in favor of the Chinese. Because, yes, that is a very, very, very hard history. It's called like this. And you should really, really read about it. And especially think about it in the context that those weapons and that oil was coming from the United States. Tensions with Japan rose when the Japanese army bombed the USS Panay as it evacuated American citizens from Nanjing, killing 3. Right? These are Americans. The US government, however, continued to avoid conflict and accepted an apology and indemnity from the Japanese. In other words, profit over even American lives. An uneasy truce held between the two nations into 1940. And now comes the important part for you of what I was talking about in my previous video. So listen closely. In 1940 and 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt formalized U.S. aid to China. Right? See the date, 1940 and 1941. The U.S. government extended credits to the Chinese government for the purchase of, what do you think? War supplies, as it slowly began to tighten restrictions on Japan, meaning they were actually doing that before or to Japan, who was at the same time invading China. What a friendship! The United States was the main supplier of the oil, steel, iron, and other commodities needed by the Japanese military, as it became bogged down by Chinese resistance. But in January 1940, Japan abrogated the existing treaty of commerce with the United States. Or was it the United States that saw that the Japanese military was being bogged down by the Chinese? And so they changed their policy or switched their loyalty, because their temporary loyalty, because that's all the United States knows, from Japan to China. Although this did not lead up to an immediate embargo. It meant that the Roosevelt administration could now restrict the flow of military supplies into Japan and use this as a leverage to force Japan to halt its aggression in China. So that was for the first part. We skip a bit and go to the last paragraph. So I have to tell you a little bit about the part that we skipped. So the part we skipped was about the US putting embargoes on Japan and cutting off supplies. So now we continue, knowing that that was happening. Faced with serious shortages as a result of the embargo, unable to retreat and convinced that the US officials opposed further negotiations, Japan's leaders came to the conclusion that they had to act swiftly. And this part is for US history very, very important, so Americans listen very closely. This is going to be about Pearl Harbor. For their part, US leaders had not given up on a negotiated settlement and also doubted that Japan had the military strength to attack the US territory. Therefore, they were stunned when the unthinkable happened and Japanese planes bombed the US fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. So the reason they actually are given is they were being cut off. They were not happy with the United States being at one time their friend and giving them everything to do the most horrific things in not only China but also in the rest of Asia, unaliving millions and millions of people in the most savage ways you can comprehend. I would highly recommend you to read this book, and you know a lot of these things what happens. Trust me, I don't want to downplay what happened in Europe as a half European myself, but what happened in Europe was like almost like nothing compared to what happened in Asia, what the Japanese were doing there. Sorry to say that. I'm not downplaying anything that happened in Europe. It was extremely bad in Europe, but nothing comparable to what the Japanese did. It went so far that even Adolf Hitler said that the pictures taken here from that situation were not allowed to be published because they would lose everybody's support. That's how bad it was. Just imagine that Hitler himself thought that was bad. When Germany stood by its ally and declared war on the United States, the Roosevelt administration faced war in both Europe and Asia. So now this is exactly what I said. They did not come to help Europe or China. It was their own war because Germany and Japan declared war on them. Only then they were coming. And this is the actual proof to support my claims in the previous video. I'm honestly glad you asked. So many more can now see that much of the history of USA being the savior of Europe and China and or the rest of Asia is a bunch of bogus. In fact, they were anything but that. And as I stated correctly, according to the US regime, as we just found out, they only came to fight their own war. And so we can safely assume that the Americans should be thankful to the Europeans and the Chinese that we all fought side by side. And actually we're helping you to fight your war while at the same time we fought ours. And all that while the US was actually fighting against us, both against Europe and both against China, by supporting the other side for profit. I hope this video was informative and gave you a lot to think about and gives you a better understanding on how the US is actually operating on the world stage. Please like, share, and if you have not yet, then follow. This was your favorite half Chinese, and as always, have a great day.